Tactics and Practice podcast.
Bonjour! Welcome to The Future Behind Us, a podcast series where I am meeting internationally renowned artists to discuss with them the stories behind works that have become iconic. I will be asking these artists about the technological, the ethical, or even the legal challenges that they have encountered while developing their project. And I will explore in their company how the meaning of their work has changed over these past 5, 10, or 20 years. My name is Régine Debatty. I am a blogger, an art critic, a curator, and my guests in the podcast series are Trevor Paglen, Nora Al-Badri, Hubert Morgan, Jill Magid, Paolo Pedercini from Molo Industria, Evan Ross, Mediengruppe Bitnik, Sanela Yaich, Pinar Yoldash, and Maya Srekar. In this episode, I am interviewing artist, writer, and filmmaker Jill Magid. Let's go! Jill Magid is an artist, writer, and filmmaker whose practice blurs the boundaries between art and life. Over the years, Magid has initiated intimate relations with bureaucracies, intelligence services, corporations, law enforcement agencies, and other structures of authority. Magid is also frequently an adjunct teacher at Cooper Union, and she's the author of 4 novellas. Her first feature film, The Proposal, was screened in international film festivals and was released in theaters across the US. So, Gilles, thank you so much for accepting the podcast invitation. I'm going to start with something I read on your bio because it's written, and I'm going to quote your biography. Her work tends to be characterized by the dynamics of seduction, the resulting narratives often taking the form of a love story. And indeed, if we look at some of your work, you attempt to establish a personal connection with people you had never met before, like a police officer in New York City, CCTV camera operators in Liverpool in England, or the director of the Barragan Foundation in Switzerland, etc. So why seduction? Why love story? Is it because you are extremely romantic, or is it because seduction is just a way to better manipulate your interlocutors?
Right. So for me, firstly, I should say, like, when I talk about seduction, I'm not talking about a kind of Harlequin romance novel. I'm talking about, or what I'm interested in my work is relationships of power and the dynamics of power and the fluidity of power. And my interest in trying to understand how systems of control work and how to gain agency inside of them and try to understand how those dynamics of power work requires me to embed myself inside of these systems and look at them really closely and look at myself inside of them really closely and create these kind of relationships inside of them. And, you know, it might be the way I see power, but also the way I embed myself is this kind of very intimate way where I'm using my body, putting it in these dynamics. And to do so is a transgression of boundaries that aren't usually crossed. And that kind of process of getting to intimately know a system through the people, which are the system who made the laws and codified it all, is an intimate process. And I find that whole operation to kind of develop into these love stories. So it's a mixture of designing them as such to get really deep into meaning, questions of meaning and boundaries and transgression and power. But it is a kind of romantic idea of observing something so closely that it becomes a part of you. And I think that just sort of naturally leads into a kind of dynamic seduction or love story.
You know, you mentioned designing this relationship. Does it mean that you prepared, that you have a strategy that is very well developed in advance, or is there still place for a lot of improvisation?
I think all of these systems require improvisation in the way that any relationship requires improvisation. I mean, to have a real relationship or one that's based on listening and understanding or a desire to understand, you have to really carefully listen. And especially in a system like this, where, I'm coming into these power situations, because as you said, I've worked with police, the Dutch intelligence agency, corporate powers that are running with for-profit and nonprofit. And each situation is different. Power is fluid and designed differently. And so I think that all I can do is prepare as much as possible. So I always, when I'm entering a system that I want to understand, I read everything about it that I can. And as I go along, I build a sense of the system's vocabulary, and then I add my own visual vocabulary through the artworks and everything that I'm making. And so when I'm referring to designing a relationship, I think it's more about being very conscious also as an artist of how I'm participating and what I'm making with my work that adds to that relationship, and kind of by doing so goes deeper into these spaces of power, into a deeper dialogue.
So I would like to have a look at an example of your work, what you did with the Dutch Secret Service. I think it was in 2005. They asked you to make a work for their new headquarters. They wanted you to help improve the public persona of the Dutch Secret Service and give it what is called a human face. Now, I've never heard of artists getting a commission from secret services. So how did that happen? How did you get that commission? Was there a public call for proposals, for example?
Yeah, so it's a strange idea that they commissioned me. But what happened was in 2006, I believe, or 2005, when this first happened, the Dutch Secret Service and Intelligence Agency was expanding because there was a large growth of terrorism at that time after the London bombings. In Holland, Theo van Gogh, who's actually related to Van Gogh, the painter, was stabbed in Vondel Park. And it was like the first political killing in Holland that happened. And so for multiple reasons, the AIVD, which is the Dutch intelligence agency, nearly doubled in size, and they had to change their building. And the new building was being funded, of course, with taxpayer money. And like New York, Holland has a 1% for art law. It's called something different, but it's basically that a percentage of the overall budget of government building has to go to an artist to make a public artwork. And so the curator of the state curator knew my work because I had just finished a piece in Liverpool for the Liverpool Biennial called Evidence Locker, where it was actually one of the foundational pieces, I would say, in my work of kind of seducing or working with systems of power. So in that one, in Evidence Locker, I learned that Liverpool at the time had the largest surveillance system in the UK, and they had 242 surveillance cameras in the city center alone, and all of them fed to a secret control room run by the police in the city center. And the way their system worked was for 31 days in a cycle, the cameras around the city would film real time, and it would go back to the secret control room, and all that footage would be held on an evidence locker and in real time. But after 3 days, the footage would go to 3 frames per second, like a time lapse. And after 31 days, all that footage would cascade off the system unless the police put it in their evidence locker because they needed it for evidence, or a citizen filled out a public access request form, which is a legal document that says who you are, where you were, the time of day, and the incident that happened. And there was a loophole in that law, which is always the way my work starts. Like, how do you find the loophole? The loophole in that law is that an incident is never there's no rule what an incident is. So me sitting down and drinking a cup of coffee is an incident. So I went to Liverpool for 31 days. I wore red every single day, and every day I filled out a subject access request form, but wrote it like a letter to a lover. So it always said, "Dear Observer." And then I would always say where I was, what I was thinking, the time of day. And by law, the police had to follow me on their surveillance system. And I was hoping to get like 1 minute of footage released to me and have all these letters, but the police got really into it and filmed me all the time. And in the end, I had 14 hours of official footage and made a series of films and a love story that's now in the Whitney collection. And so the curator of the Rijksverbouwendienst that works on behalf of the Dutch intelligence agency had just seen that work in Liverpool and called me up and said, the Dutch intelligence agency has to hire an artist on commission to make an artwork. I think you should apply. And I was like, yeah, I think so too. And so then I ended up being chosen along with another artist, Monica Salsanowska, to make a site-specific work for the intelligence agency. And it was actually my proposal that said I wanted them to hire me as a spy and to reveal the human face of the organization. And it took a year, but then I got official clearance and full vetting and got to start the project.
Oh, I didn't know that. So for your research with the Dutch Secret Service, you interviewed 18 agents. They accepted to be interviewed, but they had to remain anonymous. So I'm wondering, what were those encounters like? Was it like in a spy movie? Did you meet them at night in derelict buildings, in laundromat, etc.? What was it like?
Sometimes it was like that. Sometimes it was romantic, and sometimes it was totally banal, which I learned is what it's like to be a spy, actually, unless you're James Bond. But my interest, like it was with Evidence Locker, was to really understand what is it like to be a spy and an agent, and what is it like to have two lives, a public persona and an anonymous persona, and to occupy those positions, both of those positions at the same time. And also, I was interested almost in a godlike sense of, is there really a center of power in which, like, all, an omniscient kind of center? That was sort of the existential question. And then there was this kind of pedestrian one of this dual identity. And so the agency put an extraordinary amount of rules on me. So I was allowed to meet these agents. They had to volunteer. I had to make a commercial, actually, that played on the intranet of the Dutch intelligence agency. And I based it on this like love scene in a Godard film. And that played through the agency, and then they had to volunteer. And I wasn't supposed to ask them anything about their job. I was just supposed to ask them personal questions, but soon learned how to start asking them about their job. But anyways, the reason why they were given anonymous names, which was Miranda and then a Roman numeral, or Victor and a Roman numeral, was because the only people who work at the spy agency who are allowed to be seen on television were Victor and Miranda, and they were the press faces. And so the agents were always named Vincent and Miranda with a Roman numeral. And I had a contact on the inside who would call me, and she would say, "Hi, Jill, Victor number 4 is going to Schiphol Airport, and he's going to be at the meeting place at the center of the airport at 4:00. He'll see you there." And so I wouldn't know what Vincent number 4 would look like. But I would go to the meeting place, and they knew what I looked like from my commercial. And someone would come up to me and say, "Hi, Jill, would you like to go get a beer?" And we'd go sit and have a beer.
I want to ask you about something you mentioned in your answer. You said that you are only allowed to ask personal questions, but you found a way to ask questions or get information about their work. So how did you do that? Which strategy did you develop?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was really interesting for me because I had learned in my previous projects that if you get to know the people who are inside the system, you just automatically start understanding, what their roles were. So at the CCTV with the police, by mid-project, they had me coming in and sitting with them inside the control room. And I never told them I was an artist. But so I learned how they did their jobs and what their questions were. And I got to know them inseparable from them in uniform, But what I didn't count on when I started working with the spies is that they're spies. And when someone tells them, like, don't talk about your job, they were really good at that. And so at the beginning, I should say that might make it easier is the reason I came up with the way in to get vetted and ask them questions is there were a few things happening. One is there was this Article 12 call, which was the original name of the project before the spy project, but Article 12 was something I found in the legal papers of the AIVD that must have come out of McCarthyism era, where it said that no agent who worked for the AIVD, no record could be kept on them that dealt with their mental history, their sex lives, their religious positions, these kinds of things, like everything that makes a human really a specific human. And so I said to them, I know you're having problems with leaks and your PR is in a bad place right now. And it's because you're a faceless institution. So why don't I help reveal this kind of human side so maybe a trust will build between you and the public? That was my pitch to them. So I used Article 12 as this way, like, look, I can start asking these personal questions and get to know who these people are. And they said, okay, you can ask those questions, but you can't ask what their role is in the business. And meanwhile, I was also reading this book by Jerzy Kosinski, a Polish writer, and it was called Cockpit. And Jerzy Kosinski is one of my favorite writers because his blurring of fact and fiction, I believe, was like not even intentional. I think he actually couldn't tell the difference between fact and fiction. And he had built up this narrative about himself that he was a spy, a hummingbird, so deep undercover that even the other spies didn't know he was a spy. And so I read that book as a kind of tutorial. And so then when I would meet with the agents, I would ask them about their personal lives. And when I started getting frustrated that I wasn't learning anything about the agency, I, would ask a question or two. And usually they would say, oh, we're not supposed to answer that. But one time, one of the agents said which direction that they worked in, because the agency is broken into like counterterrorism, terrorism, censorship. That's called the direction. So one of them told me which direction they were in and basically a little bit about what they did. So then I met with another agent and I said, what direction are you in? And even the word I used, they were like, oh, I didn't know you were allowed to ask that. And I said, well, I just met with another agent who's in direction 7. And what I learned was, and would say it. And then they would say, oh, well, I'm in direction 3 and this is what I do. And I would build up each time. They would tell me more and more and more until, it got so deep that when the director of the intelligence agency read the manuscript for my novel, they called me a national security threat and confiscated my book until they redacted 40% of it.
So how did that happen? Like, is it true? I think I read that part of your work, they actually came to the exhibition at Tate Modern in London. And that's where they confiscated. Or did I get that wrong?
No, that's correct. So they confiscated me twice. The first time was I had the show that we had planned, which was in Stroom in The Hague, which is where the Dutch intelligence used to be. But then when they moved to their building, it was a different town. But there was the show in The Hague. And unlike, for instance, Evidence Locker, where the police had filmed all of the video, right? So like all the footage I had was filmed by the police. And then I edited it and the book were my letters to them. So it was very clear in that work that this was a kind of collaboration, let's say, with that system, the CCTV system. And what had been bothering me with the spy project was once I started installing that show at Strom, in a way, you could imagine that I'd made the whole thing up. Like you didn't, besides my vetting papers, which I did show, there was no real clear hand of the Dutch intelligence agency in the work. And I don't like that in my work. So I'd been writing this book that I ended up calling Becoming Tardin, because Tardin is the name of the character of Kosinski's hummingbird spy in Cockpit. So it was me becoming him. And so I knew from meeting with one of the spies who was a censor that censoring is one of the active ways that you can see the result of their collaboration. So I said to my contact, look, I'm struggling with writing the novel, and instead I made all these sculptures and other kinds of pieces in the show, but I still really want to write the book. Can I give you the rough draft and you guys bring it to the censoring office and you censor a few things? And so then there's at least one instance where I can see the hand of the intelligence agency within the work. And she was like, sure. And then, so I sort of naively gave it to her because I'd had pretty fine relations with the intelligence agency, except the director. He was never really a fan, but the head of counterterrorism was a big fan, and he was very active in the project. But anyway, so I gave the book, and then I flew back to deinstall the show. And as I landed in the airport, I got a call that I was a national security threat, and I better get a lawyer and be ready to have my computer confiscated, and that the book had crossed a line. And so in that meeting that's in my book, Becoming Tardin, we're all around a boardroom table with lawyers and the director of the Secret Service. And he says to me that they've redacted 40% of the novel. And he said that I could show the book in a one-time only exhibition, after which time it would be confiscated by the Dutch government to never be shown again, but that I could show the redacted copy. So the one-time only show would be the uncensored version, but that I had to put it under glass. And I was like, you mean as a sculpture? And he said, yes. And so at the same time, I got an invitation from the Tate Modern to do a solo show. And so I decided to use the Tate as a dead drop, which is a spy term where one spy leaves something for another spy to pick up. And I named the show Authority to Remove because the form in the Tate, when one museum wants to borrow an artwork, is an authority to remove release form. And it gives permission for another museum to go get that artwork. So I called it Authority to Remove. I placed the uncensored book in a glass vitrine, and I ripped the body of the book from the prologue and the epilogue because that's what they had redacted. And I wrote a love letter to the director of the Secret Service and said that I wrote my first novel because everything else had been too short, novella, and that it was meant for the public. But now I understood it was just our diary of our love story with each other, and that it was at the Tate Modern, and these are the opening hours. And if he wants to go get it, it's there. And my lawyer was like, they're never going to go. And on the last day of the exhibition, a black car came up with a briefcase. They came out and they confiscated the book.
Oh, so you don't know what happened to the book?
No, I'm sure that it's like on view at the Dutch intelligence agency because they have like all the work they confiscated and the work I gave them. So I assume it's like installed in their building.
Oh, wow. I'm listening to you, and it reminds me that very often when I read about your work or when I see it, I always think, well, I would never dare to do to do the kind of thing like you do. I would never dare to push the Dutch Secret Service like you did. I would, yeah, I'm just, I don't know. I would never dare to befriend a police officer like you did in 2007 for Lincoln Ocean Victor Eddy. I would never dare to ask Louis Barragan's family to have some of his cremated ashes to turn them into diamond, etc. What I mean is that where do you get all this boldness? Are you like that in real life? Is Jill Magid in real life like that, very bold, very daring? Or do you play a character when you work as an artist?
I think that the easiest way to answer that is that I'm not interested in pranks or stunts or like daringness per se. I'm really interested in how society and power is structured and what it means to be a citizen and engage with these systems. And so often people are like, well, how'd you get the police to follow you? And I'm like, I filled out the form that was there for 3 years that I was the first person to fill out. Like so many of these loopholes, I guess you could say, are publicly available. And I'm not trying to like humble myself or something, you know, but I think that there are, if you look carefully, there are ways to engage systems that seem, you know, fetishized and impenetrable. And I really am trying to, I believe in art, which is sometimes very hard to do in the way the art world exists right now. But I think that there's a real power in asking absurd questions, because if you ask questions the same way all the time, you're always going to get the same answer. Like when everyone got, not everyone, but when the people who got mad at me about the Barragan piece, they're like, well, if you wanted the archive to be publicly accessible, why didn't you just ask for that? And I'm like, because 100 people asked before me and they got the same answer. But if you ask it in an obtuse, absurdist way, it sort of destabilizes the situation, or it makes you hear the question differently. And so I believe that art can do that. And so it's not as much that like I'm being daring or I'm taking on a role. It's that the work requires that kind of commitment and those kind of absurdist acts and questions that aren't actually so absurd that they're not enacted, right? So I think that, you know, because I believe in the work, I trust the work and I trust the form that the work requires. And I therefore put myself in those positions and ask those questions or make those pieces so that the questions can be asked.
I would also like to ask you about a work you developed, I think, in 2007 called Lincoln Ocean Victor Eddy, because at the center of it is a police officer. And that got me fascinated because when I was young, including when I was a teenager, I was dreaming of working for the police. I wanted to become not just a policeman, I wanted to be Commissaire Maigret or Starsky and Hutch. But I imagine that today, if you live in New York, in London, or in Milan, police, but I don't know if many young people dream of becoming a police officer, because police forces today tend to be associated with discrimination, with abuses of power. And we saw that a lot of that emerged during the Black Lives Matter protests. So since you worked on Lincoln Ocean Victor Eddy in 2007, so before all the accusation of discrimination and abuse of power emerged, was it easier at the time? Like, would you imagine today doing the same work? Would you be more careful? Do you think the police officer would acknowledge you or welcome your request to, I think you asked the guy to train you as a police officer. So do you think they would be more suspicious today? Would it be more difficult to do that work?
Well, I think not only is every system of control different in every single city, it's not like the New York Police Department is, you know, what I learned there, I could just drop it into Germany or something like that. Like each context is different and each time is different. And I'm also different than I was in 2007. Like my more recent work, I'll approach with the experience that I've had, with the stage in my life that I'm at, and of course with the political realities around me right now. So the police have changed, and the perception of the police have changed, but the police were always a system of control and power, and always, depending on who you were or are, scary in many ways. And what I find so interesting about like the police or the AIVD or systems like that is it's this funny relationship with society that sometimes you want the police and sometimes you don't. And depending on who you are, they may always appear as a threat and never helpful. But at the time when I did that piece, I was very aware that all the policemen that I was seeing were men, firstly, and same with Evidence Locker. They were all men. So even when I first did that project, a lot of times when I was presenting it, there would always be some guy in the audience that would jump up and be like, "Do you think the police just followed you because you're a woman?" And I was like, yes, I do. I do think that helped. And if I were a person of color, or I wasn't me or my age, or, the situation would be different, because the way that system is constructed has its abuses of power and has its position. And I was coming from a very feminist perspective of thinking of the female gaze and the male gaze in cinema. And I think that's a very complicated gaze today and always has been. But thankfully, these layers of power and overlapping identities are being talked about a lot more. And Black Lives Matter movement did a lot to bring that into focus. But it's something that I was always thinking about and very aware of my position within these different situations. So 2007, when I made Lincoln Ocean Victor Eddy, which means love in police telephony language, it was New York was very much affected by 9/11. And I was meanwhile making the Spy Project, and I had come back to New York, and the city had changed from when I'd lived there because of being post 9/11, and Giuliani was the mayor. And I was an insomniac. I'm still an insomniac. But so when I couldn't sleep at night and I was lonely, I would just take the trains. And I started noticing that the police had become these kind of human surveillance cameras, and they were always standing on the platforms. And I would get on a train at 10 o'clock at night, and I'd come back at 2 a.m, and the same cop would be standing in the same place. And also, Giuliani had enacted all these laws that you could hear over the intercom system in the subway, where they said, "Please be advised you might be searched for security purposes." And so I started walking up to police officers on the subway platform and asking them to search me. And most of them told me to go away. And then this one cop, I was like, "Will you search me?" And he was like, "Why do you want me to search you?" And I was like, "Well, I heard the announcement that you might search me, and so I'm ready. Go ahead, search me." And he was like, "I can't search you, you're a woman." And I honestly had not known that. So I was surprised, and I was like, "Oh, I didn't know you couldn't search me because I was a woman." And he's like, "Yeah." And then I just said, "Will you train me instead?" Without really thinking. Now, of course, I look back and it must have been because I was being trained as a spy, but I didn't even think about it. I was like, "Will you train me?" And he was like, "What?" And so he's like, "I got to go. I have to start my shift. I work the night shift." And I was like, "Well, will you give me your number and let me ask you again?" And so he gave me the number of the police station that he worked at. And the next night I called him, and I was like, "I don't know if you know who this is." And he's like, "I know who this is." And I was like, "I was serious. Will you train me?" And he said, "I can't believe I'm doing this, but meet me at this station at this time." And it started a 4-month training session where he taught me how to be a cop in the New York City subway system.
And did I read right, or did you propose him that you would teach him art or to become an artist? I think I read that somewhere.
Yeah, no, it's in the book, Lincoln Ocean Victor Eddy. So he kept always asking me if I was a terrorist. And because he was like, "I don't understand why you want to learn the subway system." And I said, "No, actually, I'm an artist." And he was like, "Do you paint?" And I was like, "Well, I kind of do everything except painting." And he was like, "Okay, so you're a terrorist." Like he couldn't, kind of reconcile the kind of artwork that I did. And to be honest, I was depressed and I was trying to figure out what I thought the power of art was and what I had to give to the art world. So he was like, this is what you do with your life. And I was like, in my head, I don't know, is this what I do with my life? But anyways, he often complained how dangerous it was to be a police officer stationed in the subway. His whole job was to watch for terrorists. In 2007, the cops that were on the platform, their entire job was to watch for terrorists. And they went through terrorist training and all of that. But also he explained to me that the breathing in the dust from the subway station had a long history of giving police officers cancer and other problems with their lungs. And so I started to say, maybe I could get you a job in the Met as a guard of the art, and I can teach you about art, and you can teach me how to be a policeman. So that's what you read.
Wow. I have one last question, because we've mentioned the proposal and what you did to get the professional archive of Louise Barragan to be open to the public. So yes, the proposal was this film that you made that document a work you did in 2013 about the Mexican architect Louise Barragan. Now, Barragan died in 1988, I think, and since then, his professional archives, including the rights to his name, his work, and all photographs taken of it, have been bought by the chairman of Vitra and gifted as an engagement gift for his fiancée. She's an architectural historian. She's called Federica Zenko. And since then, the archive has been inaccessible to the public. And so you made this really, I think, very charming and astonishing and bold proposal to the couple. You asked them to open up Barragan's professional archive to the public. And in exchange of that, you offer to Federica Zenko a ring that was made that had a diamond that was made using the ashes from Barragan. And so in the film, the proposal, you see how Zenko is completely unwilling to engage with you at first, but then I think you manage to charm her and she engages a bit with you, but she refuses the exchange. She refuses the ring. So was the refusal to accept the ring the end of the whole project? Did it stop there?
Not at all, because firstly, I think not even as importantly, but I'll say it as it's an open proposal. So even if Federica says no to accepting the ring now, it doesn't mean it can't be accepted later. But the proposal was one of the culminating pieces of a larger project called the Barragan Archives, which you're right, started in 2013 with the first. Well, there were two shows. There was one at Art Basel Parcours, and then a larger show called Woman with Sombrero at Art in General that was just acquired by the Pompidou, as well as with the film, The Proposal, that you mentioned recently. But that piece, unlike the Spy Project and Lincoln Ocean Victor Eddy and some of the surveillance pieces, the Barragan Archives was also a question of power and legality, but more around property rights, intellectual property rights and copyright. And I was just really interested in understanding how a company, a private company, could buy the archive of a Pritzker Prize winning famous Mexican architect who only built in Mexico, who could buy his archive in Switzerland. And by buying the archive, not only own the objects in the archive, but control all of the images ever produced of Barragan's work and any images produced now. So, for instance, if you went and you took photographs of Barragan's house and wanted to publish them, you would still have to get the rights to publish them through Vitra Swiss Furniture Company. So that was my question. And it's a larger question in our societies. What does it mean just because you have money that you can buy the rights to, these really important cultural places? And, it's if you want to see the film, you can learn more about that. I know we have a short interview, but it's a really large question that Barragan is a very beautiful example of it, because you have the colonialist side of it, of a kind of Swiss organization, and then the Mexican people who don't have, if the Mexican organization, the Barragan Foundation in Mexico, wants to publish a book on Barragan, they have to pay Vitra. Like, it's crazy. So for the first 3 years of that project, I wanted to understand what those legal boundaries are, that by owning the trademark to Barragan's name and the copyright to his work, what that meant. So I made a lot of artworks that started with me asking Federica Zonco. I said I got access to Barragan's house and museum and was making artwork from there, but that I wanted her to collaborate with me and to show within my own body of work examples from Barragan's private archive that she had received as a gift in lieu of an engagement ring. And she said no, and then sent me a threatening letter that said, while I could show anything that I made from his personal archive, if I show anything that's in her private archive, basically she'll sue me. And so that first project was, how can I show pieces from Barragan's archive that I'm not allowed to represent, that show what I want to show, but are just short of breaking the law? And so I worked with a lot of lawyers, and I was like, how do I show these pieces? And I came up with a lot of different ways, to show the work, but making them into kind of sculptural forms that just almost infringed on the copyright, but didn't. So those were a series of works. And then after doing those works, exploring that, I thought, what if I could reverse the legend? So as we talked about, the story is that Rolf, when he bought the archive for Federica, she had said he proposed marriage to her. And she said, I'll marry you, but I don't want a ring. I want Barragan's archive. So he bought her the archive, and then she was the president of the Barragan Foundation. So I had this idea that I was like, what if I could reverse the legend? And what if I could make a diamond out of Barragan's cremated remains and propose to her that she takes Barragan's body and in return gives his body of work back to the Mexican public. And so I ended up getting permission from Barragan's family and Mexican Congress to exhume a portion of his ashes from the National Monument and made the diamond, and then proposed it to her in 2016. And then the film that documents that came out in 2018.
Wow. When you explain all that, the fact that the work turned out the way it turned out, it sounds like a miracle, because so many things could have gone wrong. I think it's a really exciting way to end the discussion and gives me lots of food for thought. Thank you so much for your time, Jill.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate the questions.
Well, I absolutely was fascinated by your answer. It's been obviously a pleasure to spend these few moments in your company. Well, listeners, do check out Jill's work. The address of her website is jillmagid.com, Jill Magid in one word, but you will find the exact link and more in the show notes. Thank you. Merci. Au revoir. That's it for this episode. Thank you for listening. The Future Behind Us is a podcast series conceived and conducted by me, Régine Debatty, for the 25th edition of the Pixel Point Festival curated by Aksioma Institute for Contemporary Art as part of Go 2025 Nova Gorica European Capital of Culture. Thank you to Yanis fucking Yansha for the invitation to take on this challenge and for his precious collaboration and assistance in the curatorial process. Thank you also to Marcela Okritic for the impeccable coordination. The editing, the music, and the audio post-production are all by Gašper Torkar. Next week, I will be talking with game developer, artist, and educator Paolo Pedercini from Molo Industria. We will be looking at socially engaged video games, unexpected controversies, and the future of gaming. All episodes are available at aksioma.org/podcast, on the website of the Pixel Point Festival, and on all major podcast platforms by typing Tactics and Practice in the search bar. For more information on the context, the participants, and the partners involved, see the link in the description. That's it for now. Bye everyone. Au revoir.